As the fallout from the death of Iranian commander Qasem Soleimani ripples through the stock and commodity markets around the world, leaders are also bracing for the political and strategic fallout from the strike. Joining us right now is Ian Bremmer. He's the president of the Eurasia Group. And Ian, what does this mean? What are the next steps?
Well, the Iranians clearly have to retaliate to some degree. And the way they most likely do that is against American targets if they can get to them on the ground in Iraq. That's why the State Department said everyone should leave. Having said that, the Iranians are not looking to precipitate military strikes against Iran more broadly. And every time historically they've been faced with overwhelming military force, they have actually backed down. So, I mean, I'm not surprised that the markets don't seem to be overreacting here. They're not saying we expect conflagration in the region. You also can't call Trump a hawk. I mean, every time Trump has, if he was looking for excuses to go to war with Iran, he's had ample. Right? I mean, when the Iranians took 50% of Saudi oil off the markets. He's wanted to pull out
of the region as much as possible.
He's wanted to pull out, and he's also not been eager to engage in strikes. But so clearly it was a red line when Soleimani directly orchestrated attacks against a U.S. base, American soldiers injured, one American citizen killed.
And the embassy.
And then the embassy. And I think for Trump, for Make America Great Again, we focus on the United States, Trump, that for him was a much sharper requirement to respond. And the Iranians have now seen that that response is pretty significant.
You're a policy guy, Ian, so I don't expect a non-nuanced answer. But is it, would you say, a good day for the world? Or we don't know yet because there could be some bad ramifications for the world down the road?
It's clearly the world is better off without Soleimani on it. He orchestrated Iran's proxy and terrorist network, built it across the entire region. He's directly responsible as well for the killing of hundreds of Americans on the ground in Iraq. That's been amply documented.
But if it ends up resulting in more human suffering and death, maybe it's a bad thing to do it. Maybe you just leave him on the, you contain him, but he was uncontainable, probably.
Clearly, we've had opportunities to strike this guy before. We haven't done it. It would have been more offensive if we had tried to strike him directly in Iranian territory. Harder for the Iranians to not go after the Americans directly as opposed to through proxies if we had done that. The biggest policy issue in the near term is that it's almost impossible for the Iraqis now to allow the Americans to maintain a military presence on their ground. That was already becoming an issue. Parliament was moving quickly towards a vote to tell the Americans to leave. That would obviously be an embarrassment for President Trump if it were to happen.
As you're speaking, there are just headlines coming. The Iraqi speaker offers condolences to Iran over the killing of Soleimani. And they're also saying that they would like to not see this build up or play out on Iraqi territory.
Sure.
I mean, that's the next step. But what happens if the United States is actually forced out of Iraq?
Yeah, well, I mean, one is that our ability to have a supply chain and intelligence for the more limited forces we have in Syria becomes more problematic. The ability to continue to proselytize the war against ISIS and other constituent radical parts that are growing up in that region with power vacuum also continues to grow. But Trump has said that ISIS is a much greater threat in the region than to the United States, a much greater threat to Europe than to the United States. So there's also this question of how much the Americans care. Right? I mean, at the end of the day, OPEC has much less influence today than it did 5 or 10 years ago. The Middle East is objectively less important to American national security than it was 5 or 10 years ago.
So do you think we see a buildup of American troops there or continued pullback in the region?
This is interesting, right? Because Trump has historically wanted to keep troops out of the region. And yet the total troop levels of the U.S. in the Middle East today is about what it was under Obama, right? It's increased in a couple places like Saudi Arabia. It's decreased in others. The fact that Trump has just recently, in response to the attack on the embassy, said we're sending more troops in means it's hard for him to say, oh, now we don't care. We're going to focus only on our much narrower interests, and we're not on it. We've bloodied the Iranians. That's enough. But Trump actually has nationalist bona fides vis-a-vis Iran. I mean, he's the one that pulled out of the Iranian nuclear deal, which one can say precipitated this level of escalation that we've seen over the last year and a half. He's the one that added sanctions to Iran, which helped to implode their economy, down almost 10% next year. So it's not as if Trump needs to burnish the fact that he actually is prepared to escalate against America's most committed enemy in the region. The question is he going to be able, in the short-term glare of media, to say, okay, I'm now pulling troops out of Iraq? The State Department has said all American personnel, American citizens, should leave Iraq immediately. That's different from saying American troops can just leave.
Makes it less likely or more likely that there's actually an eventual dialogue between Trump and the mullahs?
In the near term, it makes it absolutely impossible. But keep in mind, Trump is the guy that was much more interested in talking to these guys. And not necessarily the mullahs, but the president.
Right.
The French president tried to facilitate that during the United Nations meetings. Trump said he was willing to take a phone call directly to talk to him. And the Iranians said no. He used Abe, a Japanese prime minister, as well. Didn't work.
Ian, could you ever see the Iranians completely acting on the way the rhetoric is? Could you ever see them taking steps to just act completely on their threats? I just can't see it. Can you?
Look, it's not as if we took out some low-ranking general.
We did.
I mean,
but do they want a full conflict with a superpower?
No, they absolutely don't. But we do need to keep in mind that unlike in North Korea, where one guy runs the country, in Iran, there is a battle between.
And then there's everybody else they can't control, too. There's
and
all
so if it looks like, suddenly the Quds force is going to lose power, they're going to implode, their risk acceptance versus the United States goes up. But I would keep in mind that from everything we've seen from Trump so far, the idea that this is a guy looking to wag the dog really doesn't play out.